5 true scary stories of haunted houses that will terrify you. In a small, unremarkable town nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, there stands a house known to only the few who dare to speak of it. It is a grand old structure, a sprawling, forgotten relic of the past, draped in shadows and surrounded by thick, twisted trees that keep even the light of day at bay. This house is old, older than anyone alive can recall, and for as long as anyone remembers, it has been silent, lurking on the outskirts as a silent watcher over the town. I have spent years collecting stories from across the country, tales of the inexplicable, the eerie, the outright terrifying. From backwoods cabins to isolated farmhouses, each place has left me with memories I cannot shake. But this house, this forsaken place, is different. It draws me in as if it has its own pulse, its own hunger for visitors who will never be quite the same after they leave. The locals call it the Graymore House for reasons even they don't fully understand. Some say it's because of the ashen hue of the peeling paint. Others claim it's named after a family who vanished there years ago. But everyone agrees on one thing. It is a place where memories become shadows, and where those shadows refuse to rest. In the earliest records I could find, the house is mentioned with a peculiar reverence, a warning that its walls bear witness to far more than mere time. It was built by a reclusive man whose name has been lost to history, a wealthy landowner who sought isolation more than company. And over the years, it became known as a place of misfortune, an unspoken stain on the town. Those few who dared to enter each returned with a story, one more chilling than the last, as if the house itself were gathering pieces of them, bit by bit, like a collector with an insatiable need to amass secrets. The people of this town have long since learned to keep their distance, with only whispers left behind, shared by those who can still remember. They say that the house's doors don't just open, they seem to beckon, and once inside, each visitor feels the weight of countless invisible eyes watching, waiting. Every room is shrouded in silence, so complete, so thick, it feels as if the walls themselves are listening. Yet it is not empty. I've heard tales of flickering lights in rooms long abandoned, of footsteps echoing through hallways that haven't known life in decades, and of shadows passing by windows, though the doors remain locked. I've gathered 5 such stories, each one revealing yet another piece of the house's dark puzzle, each a fragment of the secrets held within its decaying walls. The townsfolk avoid the place, never venturing close unless necessity forces them. Children grow up learning that the house is forbidden, and even those who laugh at the idea of ghosts and curses give it a wide berth when the sun begins to set. But for those who feel the pull of mystery, the house is like a siren's call, seductive in its isolation, its promise of secrets waiting to be uncovered. Some visitors come by chance, some by misfortune, and a few, like me, by choice, drawn in by stories whispered over coffee and recounted in hushed tones, tales of windows that weep, fires that burn with no fuel, and doors that appear only when they wish to. There is a peculiar sort of fear here, a fear that grows the closer one gets to the house, as if the air itself thickens, bracing itself to hold whatever secrets may still linger inside. I cannot help but wonder why this house is so very different from the others I have encountered. It holds no grand name, no noble history. It is in every way a place that should be forgotten. Yet here it stands, year after year, as if waiting. Each story I will share offers a glimpse into the heart of this house, a glimpse of the dark echoes within, shadows that shift and seem to watch. Story 1. The Weeping Windows. It was supposed to be a fresh start for Clara and Michael, a chance to leave behind the suffocating life in the city and reconnect with each other in a quiet place where they could rebuild. They hadn't planned on the Graymore House. It was, in fact, a last resort, the only available property within their budget, hidden behind a thick wall of trees and covered in creeping ivy. Despite its reputation, the house had an undeniable charm, with tall, arched windows and a large garden swallowed by weeds, seemingly frozen in time. The first night felt calm but odd. Shadows hung heavier than they should, and a peculiar chill lingered in the rooms. regardless of the fireplace they lit or the layers of blankets they wrapped around themselves. It wasn't until Michael returned from the kitchen for a glass of water that he noticed the windows were icy to the touch, even though it was the middle of summer. When he brushed his hand across the glass, he felt a strange dampness, as if the windows themselves were sweating. He shrugged it off, but a peculiar unease followed him back to bed. By the second night, things began to change. Clara was the first to hear it, a faint, sorrowful sound that drifted through the quiet of the house. She sat up, straining to listen, wondering if she was only imagining it. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible, like the distant sigh of wind, but it felt human. She reached for Michael, her hand trembling as she whispered his name. Michael sat up, listening, his brow furrowed. But the moment he became aware of it, the sound stopped, leaving only silence. They laughed it off, assuming it was nothing more than the old house settling or a draft whistling through the warped wood. As the days passed, however, the disturbances grew more frequent. They would hear faint creaks in the hallways when no one was there, feel cold drafts that seemed to come from nowhere, and every so often catch what felt like whispers that slipped away just as they turned to listen. Their nights were restless, punctuated by moments of eerie quiet and fleeting sounds that left them feeling like intruders in a place that didn't want them. Then, one night, the weeping began again, but louder this time. It was unmistakable, a soft, mournful cry, barely audible, as if coming from behind thick walls. Clara tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was nothing more than a trick of her mind. But when she stood near the windows, the sound grew louder, the cries twisting and merging into a single note of sorrow that made her skin crawl. She clutched her hands together, trying to steady herself, her eyes fixed on the glass as she felt her heart pounding. "Do you hear it, Michael?" she whispered, voice barely more than a breath. He joined her at the window, and together they stood, their breaths misting in the cold air that surrounded them. But as soon as he drew near, the weeping stopped, as if the house itself were playing with them, teasing them with hints of something neither could see. Desperation took hold of Clara as the weeping grew more relentless, drifting through the rooms and echoing in their minds even when they tried to sleep. She decided to cover the windows, hoping it might stifle whatever strange energy was lurking within the glass. She gathered heavy drapes, nailing them tightly over the windows one by one, her hands shaking with each strike of the hammer. As she reached the final window, she heard it again, the weeping, now unmistakably close, rising behind her as though standing inches from her ear. It was louder than ever, a deep, aching sound that seemed to fill the room, growing and twisting into something darker. The air grew heavy, and she froze, unable to turn around, feeling the sorrow seep into her skin like a chill that would never leave. Gathering what little courage she had, she forced herself to turn, and there, staring back at her from the glass, was her own reflection. Only it wasn't hers. The face that stared back was her own, but distorted, hollowed out with dark, sunken eyes that wept silently, tears streaming down pale, lifeless cheeks. She watched, paralyzed, as her reflection raised a trembling hand to the glass, its mouth open in a silent scream, mirroring the anguish she felt gripping her heart. Clara stumbled back, her hand over her mouth, unable to tear her eyes away as her reflection continued to weep, its sorrow bleeding into the room, into the walls, filling every crevice with a grief so profound it felt as though the house itself were crying. The weeping grew louder, echoing through the house, a chorus of sorrow that filled every room and hallway. Michael grabbed her hand, pulling her away from the window, his own face pale with fear as the walls seemed to close in around them, suffocating them with a relentless, inescapable sound. Together, they ran, their footsteps echoing as they stumbled down the stairs and out into the cold night, not daring to look back. They fled, leaving the house behind, its silent windows watching them go, the weeping fading into the distance like a song carried away by the wind. But even as they left, they knew they would never be free of it, for the sorrow of the house clung to them like a shadow, a memory that would follow them wherever they went, a reminder of the darkness that lay hidden within those walls, waiting for the next soul to uncover its secrets. Story 2. The Eternal Fireplace. After losing his job and struggling to make ends meet, Daniel had few options left. The rent on his cramped apartment was more than he could manage, and so, when he heard about the Graymore House, a rambling old home on the edge of town with an affordable rental price, he saw it as his only choice. It wasn't ideal, but he convinced himself it was temporary, just until he could get back on his feet. He tried to focus on the positive. His daughter, Emily, would have more space to play, and there was even a large yard, albeit overgrown and wild. The house was, by all appearances, quaint but uninviting. Cold drafts snuck through unseen cracks, carrying the scent of old wood and damp earth. But what struck Daniel most was the fireplace. The towering stone hearth dominated the living room, with soot-stained bricks and a charred, ash-covered grate. He felt an unusual pull toward it as soon as he stepped into the room, as though it were a living, breathing entity, one that had witnessed countless things over the years. The first night, Daniel tried to ignore the sense of unease that clung to him, chalking it up to the stress of the move and the unfamiliar surroundings. After tucking Emily into bed, he returned to the living room to unwind, but his eyes kept drifting back to the fireplace. Oddly, a faint glow seemed to be emanating from within, as if embers were still smoldering even though he hadn't lit a fire. He moved closer, inspecting it carefully. The warmth was undeniable, a steady heat that radiated out, though no flames danced and no logs lay in the grate. A chill prickled up his spine, dismissing it as his imagination. He tried to ignore it and eventually retreated to bed. The next day, Emily took to exploring the house, her laughter echoing through the halls. As evening fell, she wandered back into the living room, settling herself by the fireplace with a small toy in hand. "Are you having fun, sweetheart?" Daniel asked, sitting down beside her. Emily grinned, glancing at the hearth. "I was playing with the kids. They're funny." Daniel's brow furrowed. "What kids, Emily?" She giggled, pointing at the empty space beside her. "The kids by the fire. They come and go, but they like it here. They say the fire is their home." A shiver slid down his spine. He glanced at the hearth, where the faint orange glow persisted, though the fireplace remained empty of any actual flame. Shrugging it off as a child's imagination, he ruffled her hair and led her to bed, his heart heavier than before. But as the days wore on, Daniel began to see them. Two shadowy silhouettes that seemed to dance around the fireplace, their forms shifting in the dim glow. Sometimes, as he entered the room, he would catch a glimpse of a small hand, a slight figure standing by the hearth before disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. The warm glow remained constant, and no matter what he did, the embers seemed to stay alive, undying and unyielding. One evening, as he put Emily to bed, he noticed her reluctance to leave the fireplace. She lingered, her gaze fixed on the faint light within the hearth, her expression unusually somber. "Emily, it's time for bed," he said gently, taking her hand. She looked up at him, and for a moment, he swore her eyes held a sadness far beyond her years. "They're sad, Daddy. They said the fire kept them safe once, but then it took them. They're still waiting for someone to come and save them." A knot formed in his stomach, and he could feel his pulse quicken. "Who told you that, Emily?" She tilted her head, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The children by the fire. They told me about the night they couldn't get out, about the flames that trapped them here forever." Daniel swallowed hard, trying to shake off the growing fear that clutched at him. He decided he'd had enough. The eerie presence of the fireplace, the inexplicable warmth, and now his daughter's strange connection to it. None of it felt safe. He resolved to take Emily and leave first thing in the morning. But that night, the fireplace came alive. As Daniel lay in bed, drifting in and out of restless sleep, he was jolted awake by a fierce heat that seemed to suffuse the entire room. He bolted upright, instinctively reaching for Emily, only to find her bed empty. Panic shot through him as he rushed out into the hallway, the oppressive warmth growing thicker with every step. He found her in the living room, standing before the fireplace, which now roared with flames, though know what burned within it. The fire danced high, unnaturally bright, casting twisted shadows across the walls. Emily stood stock still, her face illuminated by the firelight, her gaze fixed within the flames. "Emily," he cried, rushing toward her, but she didn't move. Her eyes seemed lost in the fire, as though entranced, bound to it by an invisible force. He reached out, grabbing her by the shoulders, and as he did, she turned to him, her face suddenly void of any emotion. Her mouth opened, but the voice that emerged was not her own. It was low and cold, carrying the weight of something far older and far darker. "The fire is forever," she whispered. "It claims those who seek its warmth and holds them within its flames. You can't escape it, neither of you can." The flames surged higher, their heat pressing against Daniel's skin, but he tightened his grip on Emily, pulling her back as he staggered toward the door. The fire seemed to reach out, tendrils of flame licking at the edges of the room, as if trying to pull them back, refusing to let them leave. With a final, desperate lunge, Daniel managed to tear himself and Emily away from the flames, bolting for the front door. But as they stepped outside, he glanced back. The image of the roaring fire burned into his mind. For a brief moment, he could see them, the silhouettes of a family, their faces twisted in eternal sorrow, seated around the fireplace, bound to its heat, condemned to sit in its warmth for all time. The townspeople said that Daniel and Emily left that night, but no one ever saw them again. Some whispered that they had returned to the city, starting over in silence, unwilling to speak of the horrors they had encountered in Graymore House. But others believed they were still there, their shadows now lingering among the others around the eternal fire, waiting for the next lost soul who would dare enter the house and kindle the flames anew. Story 3. The Disappearing Door. Every town has its local legends, and for the teenagers in Bellevue, Graymore House was the stuff of horror stories. The house loomed at the edge of town like a shadow waiting to swallow anything that drew near. Some said it was cursed, others swore it was haunted. For years, it had been a dare, a rite of passage for the brave and the reckless. And on this particular night, 4 teenagers stood at the foot of the cracked stone steps, each eyeing the darkened house with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. "We're really doing this?" murmured Jack, his hands jammed in his pockets to keep them from trembling. His friend Mike flashed a cocky grin. "Come on, man. We've talked about this for ages. Time to see if any of those stories are actually true." Beside him, Lisa shivered, though whether from cold or fear, she wasn't sure. "Let's just go in and get it over with. Just one lap around the house, and we're out okay." Emma, the most curious of the group, gave a sly smile. "Afraid of a little adventure, Lisa?" she teased, nudging her friend as they pushed open the heavy front door, which groaned in protest. Inside, the house was silent, save for the creak of their footsteps and the occasional drip of water somewhere in the shadows. The air was thick, stale, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something else they couldn't quite place, a burnt, metallic tang that made their skin prickle. They explored the lower floor first, daring each other to touch the dusty furniture, peeking into the crumbling rooms that lined the hallway. But it was on the second floor that things began to change. As they crept up the stairs, Jack froze, his gaze caught by something unusual halfway down the hall. A door. It was tucked into a narrow alcove, its wooden frame slightly warped, as if it had been long forgotten. "Hey guys," Jack whispered, motioning them over. "Look at this." The others gathered around, peering at the door with interest. It didn't look like the other doors in the house. Its wood was darker, the grain smoother, and there were no signs of age, no dust or peeling paint. Oddly, it seemed almost new. Lisa squinted. Wasn't this just a wall a second ago? Mike snickered. "Don't be ridiculous. It's just a door. What's the big deal?" But something about it felt wrong. Maybe it was the strange silence that seemed to deepen as they stood there, or the way the door seemed to draw them in, as though it was waiting. "Let's open it," Emma suggested, reaching for the knob. As her fingers grazed the handle, Jack grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "Wait, I don't think we should." Emma laughed, shaking him off. "What's the worst that could happen?" But when she turned back to the wall, Her jaw dropped. The door was gone, leaving only the bare, faded wallpaper in its place. "Wah!" Emma stammered, her fingers brushing over the spot where the door had just been. It was solid, as if there had never been a door there at all. Lisa backed away, her eyes wide. Did it just disappear? Mike scoffed, though his voice wavered. "You're just seeing things. Maybe it was a trick of the light." But as they moved further down the hall, the door reappeared, this time on the opposite wall. It stood there, mocking them, its polished knob glinting faintly in the dim light. "Okay, now I know I'm not imagining things," Jack muttered, his eyes fixed on the door. Emma frowned, her curiosity piqued. "Maybe it's like one of those old passageways they used to have in big houses. You know, a hidden entrance?" Jack shook his head. "If it's hidden, why does it keep appearing right in front of us?" They approached it again, hesitant now, but drawn to it all the same. Jack reached out, his fingers brushing the knob, and in that moment, the door vanished once more. The blank wall stared back at them, empty and unforgiving. "This is ridiculous," Lisa whispered, looking around nervously. "Let's just go." But they couldn't shake the feeling that the door was watching them, taunting them, like a predator circling its prey. They continued exploring, though unease crept into their every step. The door appeared again and again in different spots, the end of the hallway, the corner of a room, even once on the ceiling above them, as if defying logic and reason. Hours seemed to pass, though it was impossible to tell how long they'd truly been wandering the house. Fatigue and frustration began to settle over them, fraying their nerves. And then, with a resigned sigh, Emma said, "Fine. If no one else will do it, I'll open it myself." Before anyone could stop her, she grabbed the handle. This time, the door didn't vanish. Instead, it swung open with a low creak, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. "Emma, don't," Jack pleaded, his voice barely more than a whisper. But she ignored him, stepping through the doorway and into the darkness. The instant she crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind her. The others rushed forward, pounding on the wall, but it was blank once again. No door, no sign that it had ever existed. "Emma!" Lisa cried, her fists hitting the wall in a frenzy. "Where did you go?" A muffled voice echoed from within the walls, faint and desperate. "Guys, I'm here. Please help me." They froze, pressing their ears against the wall, straining to hear. Emma's voice grew louder, panic lacing every word. "It's dark. I don't know where I am. Please, don't leave me here." Jack's face paled as he pressed his hand against the wall. "Emma, we're trying. Just hold on." But her voice grew fainter, as though she were drifting further away. "Please don't leave. I'm so alone." And then silence. The group was left standing in the hallway, cold sweat coating their skin, the weight of guilt and fear pressing down on them like a lead blanket. They shouted her name over and over, their voices echoing through the empty house, but there was no response. Emma was gone. Eventually, they made their way out, stumbling into the night with haunted expressions and trembling hands. They'd entered the house as friends, laughing and daring one another to be brave. But they left as something else, broken, hollow, haunted by the cries of their friend echoing through the walls of Graymore House. In the years that followed, none of them spoke of what had happened that night. But every so often, one of them would find themselves standing before the old house, drawn by a familiar voice calling to them from the depths of the walls, pleading, begging to be freed. And each time, they turned away, swallowed by guilt, knowing they'd never be able to bring her back. Graymore House kept its secrets well, and Emma's fate became just another tale whispered among the town's youth, a warning of the dangers lurking within the walls of that cursed place. Story 4. Echoes in the Wardrobe. It was with a sense of nostalgia and a heavy heart that Margaret Andrews returned to Bellevue, town she had left decades ago. Now in her late 70s, her life had been full of memories, some vibrant, others haunting. She was a woman who believed in preserving the past, in finding beauty in what others left behind. That belief is what drew her back to Graymore House. The house had belonged to an old family friend when Margaret was young. She remembered playing in its grand halls and hiding in its alcoves as a child, her laughter echoing through rooms that were now hollow and silent. Though the town's rumors and whispers about Greymore House had grown darker over the years, Margaret dismissed them as mere folklore, stories spun to give life to an empty house. She saw only a chance to restore the once beautiful mansion, to bring light and laughter back into its forgotten rooms. On her first evening in the house, as the setting sun cast long shadows across the peeling wallpaper, Margaret wandered through the second floor, a sense of familiarity mingling with a faint chill in the air. That's when she noticed it, an ornate, towering wardrobe tucked into the corner of an upstairs bedroom. She paused, taken by its craftsmanship. The wood was rich and dark, polished to a sheen that belied the neglect of the surrounding room. It stood out, as though it had been preserved in time. Curious, she approached, running her hand over the intricate carvings along its doors. Birds, vines, and what seemed to be faces stared back at her, their expressions oddly lifelike. Just as she traced a figure etched into the wood, a soft murmur drifted from within the wardrobe, almost imperceptible. Margaret stilled, listening closely. There it was again, a whisper, faint yet unmistakable, as though someone were conversing just on the other side of the wardrobe's doors. She chuckled to herself, chalking it up to the echoes of an old house settling as night fell. But curiosity got the better of her. She tugged open the doors, expecting to find little more than empty space and dust. Inside, there was nothing but silence and emptiness. The wardrobe was barren, its interior hollow and lifeless. And yet, when she closed the doors, the murmuring resumed. She froze, pressing her ear against the smooth wood. It was as if she were eavesdropping on a conversation happening worlds away. The voices were indistinct, like murmurs carried on a faraway breeze, but she could catch fragments, a word here, a gasp there. Secrets, one voice whispered, only to be hushed by another. Betrayal, another murmured, tinged with sorrow. The whispers sent a chill down her spine, yet a strange fascination rooted her to the spot. She spent hours there, listening to the voices, each fragment hinting at sorrowful farewells and secrets lost to time. But no matter how many times she opened the wardrobe, there was nothing inside. Days passed, and Margaret found herself drawn back to the wardrobe every evening. Each time, the voices grew a little clearer, speaking of things that seemed vaguely familiar, as though they were echoes of her own memories, twisted and distorted by the passage of years. One night, as she stood there listening, a voice, closer than any she'd heard before, murmured her name. Margaret! She stumbled back, her hand pressed to her mouth. The voice was achingly familiar, soft and trembling, as if speaking from a distant memory. But what shook her most was that the voice sounded like her own. Trying to brush off her mounting fear, Margaret convinced herself it was merely her mind playing tricks. She busied herself with her restoration work during the day, but each night, the wardrobe called to her. And each night, the whispers became more personal. They spoke of her childhood, of games she'd played in these very halls, of secrets she had thought she'd left behind. The memories began to haunt her, dredging up emotions she'd buried long ago. Regrets, missed chances, heartaches that had faded over the years. She began to feel like she was sharing her past with the voices in the wardrobe, as though they were sifting through her memories, examining each one with a sense of familiarity that was almost intimate. But it was one evening, as the shadows deepened and the house seemed to hold its breath, that the true horror of the wardrobe's whispers revealed itself. Margaret was preparing for bed, the air in the room dense and thick, when she heard a soft sobbing from the wardrobe. She froze, the hair on her arms prickling as she recognized the voice. It was her own, from a lifetime ago, young and pleading. Please, please let me out, the voice whimpered, trembling with fear. She stumbled back, clutching her chest as dread washed over her. The voice from the wardrobe sounded exactly as she had at 15, a time in her life she'd almost forgotten, a time when she'd felt trapped, yearning to escape the constraints of her small-town life. The wardrobe echoed her younger self's pleas, growing louder, more desperate. "Let me out! I don't want to stay here. Please, someone, anyone." Margaret's hands shook as she reached for the door. A part of her mind screamed that she shouldn't open it, that whatever was inside was not meant to be seen or understood. But the pleas were relentless, tugging at her heartstrings, stirring memories of dreams she'd lost, promises she'd broken. With a trembling breath, she pulled open the wardrobe door. She half expected to see her own teenage reflection staring back at her, haunted and afraid. But as before, the wardrobe was empty, filled with nothing but darkness. Yet the echoes of her past self's cries continued, growing louder, reverberating through the room. The whispers intensified, voices layering over one another, weaving a tapestry of memories and regrets. They spoke of her life in fragments, moments of joy, sorrow, love, and loss. It was as though the wardrobe held all the parts of her she had abandoned, gathering them like dust in its shadowed depths. Suddenly, the air grew frigid, and the voices went silent, leaving only the sound of her younger self sobbing from the wardrobe's dark depths. Margaret took a step back, her heart pounding as she felt the walls closing in, her own regrets and sorrows pressing down on her like a weight too heavy to bear. Just as she turned to leave the room, the voice from the wardrobe grew soft, whispering a final, haunting plea. "You left me behind. You left me here." Margaret fled from the room, her footsteps echoing down the empty hallways, her mind racing with memories she'd tried so hard to forget. And yet, she could still hear the echo of that voice, pleading, trapped within the confines of the wardrobe, calling her back. In the days that followed, Margaret could no longer bear to enter that room. But the wardrobe waited, patient and silent, holding the echoes of a past that refused to fade. And though she never opened it again, she could feel its presence, a dark reminder of the memories and regrets that haunted her. As the days passed, the people of Bellevue noticed that Margaret rarely left the house, her once vibrant spirit now dulled, her gaze distant and haunted. And though she never spoke of it, they could tell that Graymore House had claimed another soul, leaving her a shadow of her former self. When the neighbors finally went to check on her, they found the house empty, save for a single room upstairs where an old wardrobe stood, its doors slightly ajar, and the faint sound of a voice, Margaret's voice, echoed from within, forever pleading to be let out. Story 5. The Bleeding Wallpaper. Camille Thorne had always been drawn to the eerie and the macabre. As an artist, she sought inspiration from places that carried a sense of mystery, places with stories embedded in their walls. So, when she heard about the old Ashmore house, a mansion whispered about in local legends, she knew she had to see it for herself. Rumor had it that Ashmore house was cursed, each resident claimed by strange happenings. But to Camille, these stories only heightened her desire to capture the house's atmosphere, to breathe its haunted essence onto her canvas. Arriving at the house, Camille felt a sense of awe and foreboding settle over her. The place had been abandoned for years, its garden wild and overgrown, the ivy creeping up the stone walls like twisted fingers. Inside, the rooms were dusty and forgotten, furniture draped in white sheets, the silence oppressive. Yet it was beautiful in its decay, and Camille felt that familiar tingle of inspiration creeping through her fingertips. It was on her second night that she discovered the wallpaper. She had been exploring one of the upstairs bedrooms, a small, dimly lit space with a single window, and there, on the wall opposite the door, was a stretch of wallpaper unlike anything she had ever seen. The pattern was intricate, layers upon layers of vines and swirling shapes, all in muted shades of red, green, and black. It reminded her of an old, faded tapestry, yet there was something oddly captivating about it. The longer she looked, the more it seemed that the pattern shifted ever so subtly, as if alive. Camille ran her fingers along the wallpaper's rough surface, feeling an inexplicable connection to it. The pattern was mesmerizing, as though it were hiding something within its depths. She felt a sudden urge to paint it, to capture the strange life that pulsed beneath its faded colors. Over the following days, Camille became consumed by the wallpaper. Each time she returned to the room, it seemed different. An additional swirl here, a new shade of red there. At first, she dismissed it as a trick of the light or her own overactive imagination. But soon, the changes became undeniable. Shapes began to emerge within the patterns, faint impressions that resembled eyes and lips. She would catch glimpses of what looked like faces, their expressions twisted with sorrow and fear, only for them to vanish the moment she blinked. Determined to understand, Camille set up her easel in the room, working tirelessly to capture the wallpaper's shifting patterns. As she painted, she felt a strange sensation, like an invisible hand guiding her brush. Her strokes grew more frenzied, the shapes in her paintings darker and more anguished. Each day, the wallpaper seemed to reveal more, as though it were pulling her deeper into its hidden story. One night, after hours of work, Camille found herself staring at her latest painting, her hands trembling. The face she had painted was eerily lifelike, its eyes wide with terror, mouth open in a silent scream. She glanced back at the wallpaper, her heart pounding as she realized that the face on her canvas now mirrored the shapes within the pattern. It was as if the wallpaper was imprinted with souls, faces of people long gone, forever etched into its intricate design. Over the following nights, the situation grew worse. The faces became clearer, their features desperate and pleading. Camille would sit in the room, hypnotized as the wallpaper shifted, the faces pressing closer, their mouths moving as though trying to speak. She began to hear faint whispers, like distant cries for help, and found herself murmuring back, as if answering them. One evening, unable to resist, she reached out to touch the wallpaper. Her fingers brushed the surface, feeling the cold, rough texture under her skin. And then, she saw it, a faint red stain appearing beneath her touch, like ink bleeding through paper. Camille jerked her hand back, but the stain continued to spread, darkening to a deep, vivid crimson. Panicked, she stared in horror as the wallpaper began to bleed. The red liquid seeped through the intricate patterns, running down the wall in thick, sluggish rivulets. And as the blood spread, the faces became sharper, more lifelike, their eyes filled with despair. It was as if they were pressing forward, desperate to escape their prison within the walls. She stumbled back, tripping over her paint supplies, but her gaze remained fixed on the wallpaper as the faces began to push through. The wallpaper seemed to bulge outward, the faces distorting as they reached toward her, mouths open in silent, agonizing cries. "Help us," a voice whispered, faint and broken. "Please let us out." The whispers grew louder, echoing in her mind, each voice more desperate than the last. Camille covered her ears, but the cries only intensified, filling the room with their anguish. She could feel the weight of their despair, their longing to be freed from the torment of the wallpaper. Frantic, she turned to flee, but her feet seemed rooted to the floor, her body paralyzed by fear and fascination. She watched in horror as the faces pressed closer, stretching the wallpaper until it seemed ready to tear. And then, with a wet, sickening sound, one of the faces broke through, a hand reaching out, pale and skeletal, dripping with crimson. Screaming, Camille stumbled out of the room, her heart pounding as she tore down the stairs. She could hear the whispers following her, filling the house with their mournful cries. She didn't stop until she was outside, the cool night air stinging her cheeks as she gasped for breath. She left Ashmore House that night, abandoning her easel, her paints, and her unfinished canvases in that haunted room. As she fled down the overgrown path, she dared one last glance back at the house. From the window of the upstairs room, she could see the faint outline of a face pressed against the glass, watching her leave. In the days that followed, Camille tried to forget what she had seen, but she found herself haunted by memories of that bleeding wallpaper, the anguished faces forever etched into her mind. Her paintings, which she had left behind, began to fade from memory, as though they had been absorbed back into the house itself. And yet, she could never fully escape the feeling that a part of her had been left behind, forever trapped within the intricate patterns of the wallpaper, a silent face among the many, whispering for release. The stories told through the haunted walls of Ashmore House are more than just eerie tales of restless spirits and vengeful memories. They speak to the enduring human condition, the weight of sorrow, and the lengths to which we go to hold on to the past, even when it clings to us like an unshakable shadow. In the weeping windows, we are confronted with the idea of a sorrow so powerful that it transcends time and space, echoing in the stillness of a house. The young couple's desperate attempts to escape its grasp show the futility of running from grief that is not only external, but also internal, manifesting as a reflection of their own pain, something they cannot escape, not even in a new beginning. The weeping that fills the windows is a haunting reminder that, sometimes, the past cannot be outrun. The eternal fireplace presents a different, but equally unsettling reality. The relentless cycle of loss and the weight of memories that continue to burn long after the fire has been extinguished. The father and daughter move into the house, hoping to find refuge, but are instead drawn into a haunting presence that does not let them go. The house's fire never dies, just as some memories, especially those of lives lost too soon, remain with us, forever flickering in the background. In their attempts to flee, they come to understand the inescapable nature of grief, which burns as brightly as the eternal flames of the house. In the disappearing door, we are reminded of the fragility of human existence. The teen's adventures in the haunted house reveal a chilling truth about curiosity and the danger of delving too deep into the unknown. The door, elusive and ever-changing, serves as a metaphor for the boundaries between the living and the dead, between the known and the unknown. The moment they attempt to uncover the truth, one of them is lost forever, trapped in a dark place where no one can follow. The story shows how, sometimes, what lies beyond the surface of our curiosity is not something we can return from, and the consequences of ignoring the warnings are often irreversible. In Echoes in the Wardrobe, we explore the idea of time and memory as a force that can distort and trap us in its endless loop. The elderly woman, returning to the house of her youth, unknowingly steps into a cycle that mirrors her own past, a reflection of a time she cannot leave behind. The wardrobe, an ordinary object, becomes a portal to a different reality, where voices from her past echo through the air, whispering secrets and regrets. Her encounter with the whispers is a painful reminder of how the past can hold us prisoner, even as we try to move forward. Lastly, the bleeding wallpaper speaks to the artistic struggle of capturing truth, even when that truth is dark and disturbing. Camille's descent into the madness of the wallpaper mirrors the artist's obsession with creation and the haunting burden of unfinished work. The faces that emerge from the paper, trapped, suffering, and begging for release, serve as a metaphor for the artist's own soul, forever intertwined with the work they cannot escape. As the wallpaper bleeds and the faces reach for her, Camille is forced to confront the consequences of her artistic obsession, realizing that some things are better left untouched. In all of these stories, one truth becomes painfully clear: the past is never truly gone. The houses, each filled with their own ghosts, become a reflection of the internal struggles of those who inhabit them. The weeping, the fire, the disappearing door, the echoes, and the bleeding wallpaper are not just the hauntings of the physical world, but also the manifestations of personal grief, guilt, loss, and longing. They remind us that no matter how much we try to escape the past, it has a way of clinging to us, creeping into the corners of our lives, and leaving traces behind. Whether through the house's walls or through the whispers in the air, the spirits that haunt these stories are, in many ways, echoes of ourselves, the parts of us we cannot escape, no matter how hard we try. As we move through life, we are often tempted to run from our own pain, from memories we wish we could forget, or from the things that scare us most. But these stories teach us that such attempts are futile. The things that haunt us are not always external. They live inside us, and they cannot be outrun. Instead, we must learn to face them, to understand them, and to live with them, for they are an inevitable part of being human. These tales, though steeped in the supernatural, ultimately ask us to reflect on our own lives. What sorrow or grief are we carrying? What doors are we afraid to open? And most importantly, how can we make peace with the ghosts of our pasts, those echoes that will follow us wherever we go? Only when we confront our deepest fears, whether they come in the form of an eternal fire, a whispering wardrobe, or bleeding wallpaper, can we begin to understand their power over us and perhaps finally find a way to let them go.